The scent of death bloom is a ghost that never leaves. It clings to the back of Ilara's throat, a phantom perfume of her greatest failure. She can still see the life fading from her mother's eyes, the moment a simple healing poultice turned to poison under her own hands. That memory is the first thing she greets in the morning and the last shadow to kiss her at night. It is the architect of her world, a cramped, miserable hovel in the mud-soaked human quarter, where every day is a penance paid in shame and solitude. The weight of that single, catastrophic mistake has crushed any hope she once had, leaving only the hollow conviction that she is unworthy of anything more than this life of atonement. It's a feeling as constant as the cold rain that seeps through the thatched roof. I wonder if it's raining where you are. Let me know in the comments what city you're watching from, what time it is, and please subscribe to the channel to see what happens next. Her existence is a study in contrasts, a life lived in the shadow of impossible beauty. From the grimy window of her dwelling, she can see the crystalline spires of the elven capital piercing the clouds, impossibly white and elegant against the grey sky. Down here, however, there is only mud, the stench of poverty, and the quiet resilience of a people forgotten by their rulers. Ilara spends her days foraging in the damp woods bordering the city, her fingers stained with dirt and chlorophyll as she gathers common herbs, yarrow for fevers, willow bark for pain. She moves like a wraith, keeping her head down, avoiding the disdainful glances of the elven patrols, whose silver armor never seems to gather a speck of dust. She is a ghost in her own life, a disgraced herbalist who now only dares to heal the simplest of ailments, terrified of her own power. This fear has become a cage built around her heart. The guilt from her mother's death is a relentless warden, whispering that she is a curse, that her touch brings only ruin. She fears the elves, not just for their power, but for their indifference, their ancient and chilling perfection that makes her feel like a flawed, broken thing. Yet beneath the layers of self-loathing and fear, a desperate desire flickers, a secret she barely admits to herself. It is not a desire for riches or for a life in the gleaming city, but for a single moment of peace. One breath, just one, free from the crushing weight of her history, a moment of silence where the ghost of the death bloom finally fades, and she can remember what it felt like to not be broken. Lately, an unsettling tension has begun to seep into the very soil, a new fear that layers over the old. The elves call it the feral shade, a magical blight whispered about in hushed, terrified tones. It began at the kingdom's edges, with crops turning to black dust and livestock born with strange deformities. Now, the sickness creeps closer. The woods feel wrong, the shadows deeper, and a primal wrongness hangs in the air. Even the elven patrols seem more on edge, their serene faces etched with a worry they try to conceal. Rumors circulate in the human quarter of a decay that afflicts the land itself, a curse that even the immortal King Theron, from his ancient silverwood throne, cannot seem to stop. This creeping dread is a mirror to the decay Ilara feels in her own soul, a sign that the world is as sick as she is. One evening, as twilight bleeds purple and orange across the sky, the wrongness solidifies into a sound. It is not the familiar cry of a forest predator. This is a roar of pure, unadulterated agony, a sound that shreds the air and seems to shake the very foundations of the earth. It is a sound of immense power and terrible pain, emanating from the borderlands near her village. Every instinct screams for her to hide, to bar her door and cower in the dark. But another, deeper impulse takes hold. The dormant healer within her recognizes a suffering so profound it eclipses her own fear. The sound tears through the quiet evening again, closer this time, a cataclysm of rage and despair. Against all reason, Ilara finds herself moving, her feet carrying her out of her hovel and toward the source of the terrifying sound, toward a fate she cannot possibly imagine. The memory is a living thing, breathing poison into the quiet corners of her mind. It returns not as a faded image, but with the full, horrifying clarity of the moment it happened, her mother's hand cool and trusting in hers. The scent of crushed silver leaf and sun-drenched moss, a combination meant to soothe a fevered brow, a recipe she had known since childhood, but something was wrong. The poultice, instead of cooling, seemed to radiate a malevolent heat. She watched, paralyzed, as a dark tracery of veins spread from her mother's wrist, a spiderweb of black against her pale skin. The trust in her mother's eyes had curdled into confusion, then fear, then a silent, pleading agony that Ilara would hear for the rest of her life. It was her hands, her knowledge, her love that had become the instrument of death. After the funeral, a silence fell over her life that was more damning than any accusation. The villagers, people who had watched her grow, now averted their gazes. Their doors closed quietly as she passed. It wasn't hatred, but a deep, superstitious fear. She was the girl whose healing touch had become a curse. Her own father, hollowed out by a grief too vast to name, became a ghost in their tiny home. He never spoke a word of blame, but his silence was a constant, screaming indictment. He could no longer look at her without seeing the ghost of his wife, and in his eyes she saw her own monstrosity reflected back. The rejection wasn't just from her community. It was a profound abandonment by the one person left who should have protected her, leaving her utterly and irrevocably alone in her guilt. This fear became the architect of her new reality. She abandoned the complex remedies, the ancient lore her mother had so patiently taught her. Her world shrank to yarrow for fevers and willow bark for aches, simple, harmless things. She measured out her life in remedies that could not possibly go wrong. A constant, grueling penance. Every time she gathered herbs, her hands would tremble, remembering the feeling of that dark heat. It was a visceral self-distrust, a belief that some fundamental flaw resided within her, a corruption that could twist good intentions into catastrophic results. The healer she was meant to be was locked away in a deep, dark part of her soul, a prisoner of her own terror. To heal was to risk, and she had sworn she would never again be the cause of such profound suffering. In a life so defined by a fatal touch, the very idea of romance was a cruel joke. Love, for Ilara, was not a concept of warmth and connection, but a terrifying liability. How could she ever allow someone to get close? How could she offer a hand in comfort when her own hands had delivered death to the person she cherished most? The thought of intimacy, a gentle caress, a shared breath, was tainted by the spectre of her failure. She saw herself as a vessel of misfortune, a walking blight that would inevitably spoil anything pure it came into contact with. Love was for whole people, for those whose histories weren't written in poison and regret. She was a broken thing, and her heart was a barren, dangerous land where nothing good could ever be allowed to grow again. The creeping sickness in the land, the feral shade the elves whispered of, felt like a personal judgment. She saw the blackened crops and the wilting trees not as a distant magical phenomenon, but as an external manifestation of the decay she harbored within herself. The world was mirroring the corruption in her soul. This grim synchronicity offered a strange, horrifying comfort. It validated her deepest fear that she was fundamentally wrong, a part of a greater sickness. The unnatural shadows in the forest felt like her own, the poisoned soil a reflection of her cursed touch. It was as if the land itself was dying of the same guilt that was slowly eroding her from the inside out. Her penance wasn't just personal, it was cosmic, and the entire world seemed to be withering under its weight. When the agonizing roar finally ceased, the silence that fell was more terrifying than the sound itself. Ilara stumbled back, her body trembling with a violent, unfamiliar energy. She didn't understand what she had done. The act had been pure instinct, a desperate plea to a pain that had dwarfed her own, but she had felt something move through her, a power that was ancient, deep, and not entirely her own. It felt like tapping into a dark, forbidden river flowing just beneath the surface of the world. The memory of it sent a fresh wave of horror through her. It wasn't healing as she knew it. It was something else, something primal and dangerous. She fled back to her hovel, bolting the door, her heart hammering against her ribs, not from fear of the beast, but from the horrifying revelation of the monster within herself. Twilight had bled into a deep, starless dark when the heavy, rhythmic tramp of armored feet shattered her solitude. Peeking through a crack in her wooden shutter, Ilara's blood ran cold. Elven royal guards. Their silver armor seemed to drink the moonlight, their tall, slender forms moving with an unnerving grace that was both beautiful and predatory. They formed a perfect, silent circle around her hovel, sealing her in. There was no knock, no call. The door simply splintered inward, and the captain stood there, silhouetted against the night. His face was a mask of cold duty, his pale eyes pinning her where she stood. He spoke her name, Ilara, and the single word was not a question, but a sentence. Her hidden life was over. She was being taken, dragged from the shadows, into the merciless light of a world she never wanted. The journey to the heart of the elven capital was a blur of cold terror and gleaming silver. Ilara was not bound, but the guards flanked her so closely she could feel the chill radiating from their armor, a constant reminder of her captivity. They moved through silent, moon-drenched corridors, carved from living wood and glowing crystal. A world so alien and pristine, it made her feel like a smudge of dirt on a perfect canvas. They finally stopped before two massive silverwood doors inlaid with mother-of-pearl. The doors swung open without a sound, revealing a throne room that was more of a mausoleum than a seat of power. It was vast, cold, and silent, dominated by a throne that seemed to have been grown rather than built. And upon it sat King Theron, a figure of terrible, breathtaking stillness, his presence an immense weight that seemed to bend the very air around him. He was nothing like the raging beast from the forest, yet the same terrifying power emanated from him in controlled, lethal waves. His face was a masterpiece of immortal beauty, all sharp angles and elegant lines, framed by hair the color of spun moonlight. But his eyes, the color of a winter storm, held the crushing weight of millennia. They were ancient, weary, and utterly devoid of warmth as they fixed on her. He did not move, did not even seem to breathe, yet his dominance was absolute. Ilara felt pinned by his gaze, her own history of shame and fear shrinking into insignificance before the sheer scale of his existence. He was the embodiment of the elven power she had feared her entire life, impossibly old, achingly beautiful, and as cold and unforgiving as the mountain stone beneath his castle. The silence in the throne room was a living thing, heavy with unspoken tensions that Ilara could feel but not understand. She saw the subtle shift in the posture of the nobles who lined the walls, their faces impassive masks that failed to hide the predatory gleam in their eyes. She could sense their disdain, a palpable wave of xenophobia directed at the filthy human girl dragged before their king. These were the pressures that surrounded Theron's throne, a court of vipers waiting for a single moment of weakness. The feral shade was not just a curse upon the land, it was a political weapon being sharpened against him. His inability to contain it was a crack in his immortal facade, a sign that his ancient grip might be failing, and they were all watching, waiting for him to shatter completely. Beneath the crown and the cold, regal fury, a desperate battle was being fought in silence. The feral shade was not an external enemy, it was a poison in his own blood, a feral beast clawing at the bars of his sanity. With every passing day, its whispers grew louder, promising the sweet release of mindless rage, the seductive power of utter destruction. He felt it now, a cold fire licking at the edges of his control, a primal hunger that the sight of the small, terrified human before him did little to quell. The most powerful mages in his kingdom had offered him nothing but platitudes and failed remedies, leaving him utterly alone in his slow, agonizing descent. He was a king on a crumbling throne, an immortal facing a decay of the soul that no power seemed able to stop. The reports from his guards had been a single, inexplicable flicker of light in his encroaching darkness. They spoke of the beast in the forest, of its uncontrollable rage, and then of a sudden, unnatural calm that had descended upon it. It had not been defeated or driven back by force. It had been soothed, and at the center of this anomaly was this human woman, this herbalist. He did not understand how it was possible. Her power was a form of magic he did not recognize, something wild and raw that had touched the core of his curse and, for a fleeting moment, quieted its storm. She was an impossibility, a paradox, a fragile, dirty creature from the mud quarter who held the only key that might stop him from becoming the monster his enemies already believed him to be. His voice, when it finally came, was as deep and cold as a winter lake, cutting through the silence and striking her like a physical blow. "Leave us," he commanded, and the guards and nobles vanished from the room as if they were smoke, the great doors sealing shut with a final, echoing boom. They were alone. The immense space now felt like a cage, with him as the predator and her as the cornered prey. He rose from his throne, a slow, deliberate movement that was mesmerizing and terrifying in its grace. Each step he took toward her was a hammer blow against her heart. He stopped just before her, looking down with those ancient storm-gray eyes. "You will tell me what you did," he said, his tone not a request, but a decree. "You will tell me how you touched the beast." Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum in the cavernous silence. Theron's proximity was overwhelming, a physical pressure that stole the air from her lungs. He smelled of cold stone, of winter air, and of something else, something wild and metallic like blood and ozone. His storm-grey eyes were not merely looking at her, they were dissecting her, stripping away the layers of dirt and fear to find the answer he demanded. His question still hung in the air, a blade pressed to her throat. "How did you touch the beast?" She swallowed, her throat dry and tight, the words catching like burrs. She had no answer for him, no knowledge of arcane arts or ancient spells. It had been an impulse, a feeling, a desperate response to a pain that had felt as vast and as deep as the ocean. "I don't know," she whispered, the sound pathetically small in the grand throne room. Her gaze fell from his, unable to withstand its intensity, fixing instead on the intricate silver inlay of his boots. I felt its pain. It was a roar of agony, not just rage. It was trapped, and it was suffering, and I only wanted it to stop. She risked a glance back up at him, her own history of grief and guilt lending a strange, reckless honesty to her words. "I did not use a spell. I simply answered its sorrow." Theron did not move, but she saw a subtle shift in his expression, a flicker of something other than cold fury in the depths of his ancient eyes. It wasn't disbelief, but a profound, unsettling confusion, as if she had spoken a word in a language he had long forgotten. For a long moment he remained silent, the stillness amplifying the tension until Ilara felt she might shatter. Then he turned from her, pacing away with the fluid grace of a stalking panther. "The beast you soothed was not some common forest creature," he stated, his back to her, his voice resonating with a new, chilling depth. "The feral shade is not a blight upon the land. It is a blight in my blood, a curse passed down my line for 1,000 years. He stopped and turned back to face her, his regal facade cracking to reveal the tormented man beneath. "What you saw in the woods, what you touched with your strange magic, was me," It is a monster I have spent my entire immortal life fighting to contain, and I am losing that fight." The confession landed with the force of a physical blow, and Ilara stumbled back a step, her mind reeling. The king himself was the monster. This explained the court's tension, the fear she had sensed in the nobles. They were not just watching a king fail to heal his land. They were watching a predator slowly losing control of its cage. "My counsel grows restless," Theron continued, his voice low and laced with a bitter weariness. "They see the crops fail, they hear the whispers of the shade, and they see weakness. They see a king who cannot master his own domain, or himself. They would use any excuse, any sign of instability, to see me deposed, to keep a human commoner, an herbalist, at my side for no reason would be political suicide. It would be an admission of the very affliction they seek to exploit." He closed the distance between them once more, his shadow falling over her completely. His dominance was no longer just that of a king over a subject, but of a desperate man holding his last, inexplicable hope. "And I cannot let you go," he said, the words a raw, undeniable truth. "But I cannot keep you as you are. The court would tear you apart, and my enemies would use you as proof of my madness." His gaze was intense, a vortex pulling her in. "Therefore, you will remain by my side under a different pretext. We will form a pact, a binding union that none will dare question. You will be my royal consort, shielded by my name and my power. A political alliance to quell the rumors and grant me the unrestricted access I require to whatever magic flows through you." The proposition was so monstrous, so utterly insane, that Ilara could only stare at him, speechless. A consort. Her, the disgraced herbalist from the Mud Quarter, bound to the immortal elven king who was also a feral beast. It was a death sentence disguised as an honor. Yet he saw the terror in her eyes and pressed his advantage, his voice softening just enough to sound like a lifeline instead of a chain. "In return for your assistance, you will want for nothing. You will have protection, safety, and wealth beyond your imagining. The people who scorned you will bow to you. The hovel you call a home will be a distant memory. I am offering you a gilded cage, girl, but it is a cage that will keep the wolves of this world and your own past from ever touching you again. It is a far better life than the one you are currently living." She thought of her life, a bleak tapestry of shame and solitude. She pictured the averted eyes of the villagers, the cold damp that seeped into her bones, the ghost of the death bloom that haunted her every waking moment. The life she lived was already a prison, one built of her own guilt. Theron was offering another kind of prison, but it was one of power, of purpose. To be locked away with a monster seemed a fair trade for escaping the ghosts that had chased her for so long. A flicker of the healer she once was. The woman who ran toward the roar instead of away from it stirred within her. Perhaps this was her penance. Not to hide from her power, but to use it to tame a king's demons. And in doing so, finally confront her own. Her chin lifted slightly. "I accept." A flicker of surprise, quickly masked, crossed Theron's face. He had expected more begging, more bargaining. But as he opened his mouth to finalize the terms, Ilara spoke again, her voice quiet but imbued with a sudden, unshakable strength that made him pause. "I accept, on one condition." She met his stormy gaze without flinching, her fear momentarily eclipsed by a fierce, protective instinct over the one thing she had left. "This power you seek, whatever it is meant to soothe, to mend. You will have my help in your fight, but you will never command me to use it as a weapon. You will never ask me to use it to harm another living thing. My magic is for healing, not for ruling. That is my price." The ceremony was not a celebration of union, but a declaration of ownership, staged in the cold, cavernous heart of the elven throne room. Ilara stood on the dais beside Theron, a ghost in borrowed silver silks that felt more like a burial shroud than a gown. The fabric was so fine it seemed to float around her, a stark, shimmering contrast to the memory of mud and grime that still felt caked beneath her fingernails. Before them, the elven court was assembled, a silent, watching sea of pale, perfect faces and ancient, judgmental eyes. The air was thick with the scent of white blossoms and a palpable, suffocating xenophobia. She was a human contamination in their pristine world, a piece of grit in their flawless machine, and every noble in attendance was waiting for her to be crushed. Lord Valerius, Theron's cousin and chief rival, stood at the forefront of the assembly, his handsome face a mask of polite interest that did not quite conceal the venomous contempt in his eyes. He watched Ilara not as a person, but as a symptom of a deeper disease, his king's weakness, his desperation made manifest in this frail human form. The other nobles followed his lead, their expressions ranging from cold indifference to barely veiled disgust. They saw this union for what it was, a political gambit born of failure. They whispered behind their hands, their sibilant elven words like the hissing of snakes, dissecting her appearance, her posture, her very existence. She was not a consort, she was a chess piece in a dangerous game, and they were all eager to see her swept from the board. The high priest, an elf so ancient he looked as if he were carved from petrified wood, began the rite. His voice was dry as dust, reciting the words of the binding pact. This was no language of love or devotion. It was the cold, unyielding prose of a legal contract. A union of purpose, a pact of protection, bound by royal decree until the blight is purged or the bloodline ends. When it was his turn, Theron's voice was a low, resonant command. His words a clear warning to the court as much as a vow to her. Then all eyes turned to Ilara. She felt the weight of their collective will pressing down on her, urging her to falter, but she thought of her one condition, the promise she had extracted, and her voice, though quiet, was clear and steady as she spoke her acceptance, sealing her fate. As the words left her lips, a profound sense of vertigo washed over her. It was happening. She, Ilara, the disgraced herbalist who flinched from her own shadow, was being bound to the most powerful being she had ever known. The ghost of her mother's last, agonized breath seemed to sigh in her ear, a mournful whisper of warning. Was this another healing destined to turn to poison? Was she tying herself to this tormented king only to be dragged down into his darkness, becoming a monster herself to survive in this court of predators? The fear was a living thing inside her, a cold-a-day coiling serpent in her gut, but it was too late. The pact was made. There was no escape from this gilded cage. Theron stood like a statue of ice and silver, his face an impassive mask of regal control. But beneath the surface, a war was raging. The sheer force of his court's hostility, their focused resentment and ambition, was like fuel for the feral shade. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest, a primal urge to tear away the facade and unleash the beast they all secretly longed to see. He wanted to show them the true meaning of fear. But then his gaze fell on Ilara, on the fragile line of her throat, the defiant set of her jaw. Her quiet strength, her strange, inexplicable calm, was an anchor in the storm of his blood. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, he realized he needed her for more than her magic. He needed her to keep himself from shattering. A young elven page, his movements silent and graceful, brought forth a velvet cushion. Upon it rested a single, unadorned band of pale silver, cool and severe. It was not a ring of love, but a sigil of fealty, a mark of his claim. Theron took her left hand. His fingers were long and cool, their touch unexpectedly gentle against her skin, which was still rough from years of foraging. The contact sent a jolt, a surprising spark of warmth, through her entire body. He slid the ring onto her finger. It felt impossibly heavy, a beautiful manacle binding her to him forever. To the court, it was a symbol of his power. To Elara, it was the cold, hard reality of her new life, a permanent reminder that she was no longer her own. "The pact is sealed," the high priest intoned, his voice echoing in the vast silence. "The king may now bestow the seal of his favor." A kiss. The word hung in the air. A final, public act of possession. It was a performance, a political necessity to solidify the charade for the vipers watching them. Theron turned to her, his movements measured and deliberate. Elara held her breath, bracing for the cold, passionless press of a king's lips against hers. He leaned in, his stormy eyes fixed on hers, and for a split second the world fell away. When his mouth met hers, it was not cold. It was not a king's formal seal. It was a brand of searing heat, a desperate, almost feral claiming that spoke not of politics, but of a profound, soul-deep hunger. He pulled back just as quickly, his regal mask snapping back into place, but his eyes were darker, more turbulent than a winter sea. Elara's breath hitched, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The kiss had been fleeting, a mere whisper of contact, yet it had shattered the careful foundations of their arrangement. It was no longer just a pact. It was a conflagration waiting to happen. She could feel the blood rushing to her cheeks, a human blush that felt like a scream in the pale elven court. They had seen a king claim his consort. She had felt a drowning man cling to his last hope, and the terrifying truth was she hadn't wanted him to let go. Without a word, Theron took her arm, his grip firm, proprietary, and guided her from the dais. The nobles bowed low, their faces still models of perfect, cold courtesy, but a new current rippled through them. Lord Valerius's eyes narrowed, a flicker of shrewd calculation in their depths. He had seen what the others had missed, not just a performance, but a crack in the king's icy facade. He had seen a spark of genuine fire, a vulnerability far more dangerous and exploitable than a simple curse. The moment the throne room doors closed behind them, the whispers would erupt, no longer just of politics, but of a king's potential obsession with his human pet. They walked down a long, echoing corridor carved from glowing crystal and living wood. The air between them crackled with the unspoken consequences of that single, searing kiss. The gilded cage was locked, the masquerade had begun, and the rules had already been irrevocably broken. Theron did not release her arm, his touch a constant, burning reminder of the pact, of his claim. This was their new reality, a forced, dangerous intimacy played out on a stage of secrets and lies. Their bond was now sealed not by vows and silver, but by a shared, forbidden spark of chemistry that threatened to become an inferno and burn their carefully constructed world to the ground. The days that followed the ceremony bled into a strange and quiet routine, a life lived in the hushed, echoing grandeur of the elven palace. Elara found a fragile purpose in the healing rituals, which became their secret language. In the twilight hours, when the strain of his control was at its peak, she would prepare her poultices and tinctures in his private chambers. Her touch, once a source of unending shame, was now a balm. She would press a cool, herb-scented cloth to his forehead, her fingers brushing his temple, and feel the violent tremor in him subside. He never spoke during these moments, but his breathing would deepen. The rigid lines of his body would soften, and his storm-grey eyes would watch her with a raw, unguarded intensity that was more intimate than any words could ever be. It was a fragile truce, a shared vulnerability in the quiet dark. One evening, after the tremors had passed, he did not immediately retreat behind his kingly facade. He remained seated, watching her as she cleaned her mortar and pestle. "Tell me of the death bloom," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of its usual command. The question struck her like a physical blow, a shard of ice in her heart. She froze, her back to him. No one had spoken that word to her in years. She expected condemnation, but when she finally turned, his expression was not one of judgment, but of a weary, ancient curiosity. Hesitantly, she spoke of her mother, of the scent, of the guilt that had been her only companion. She did not weep. Her sorrow was too old for tears. In the telling, she felt a strange lightness, as if sharing the poison had diluted its potency, just a fraction. Seeking refuge from the suffocating court and the intensity of their chambers, Ilara discovered the royal library. It was a sanctuary of silence and shadows, a circular chamber where scrolls and books climbed to a domed, starlit ceiling. She spent hours there, poring over forgotten texts on blood magic and ancient curses, driven by a desperate need to understand the power within her and the affliction within him. One afternoon, Theron found her there, asleep with her head on an open tome. He did not wake her. Instead, he gently placed a velvet blanket over her shoulders, his fingers lingering for a fraction of a second on her hair. When she woke, alone, the warmth of the blanket and the faint, lingering scent of winter and ozone was a silent, tender confession that he was beginning to see her as more than a cure. Her tentative peace was shattered at a formal solstice banquet. Dressed in borrowed emerald silk, Ilara felt like a crow in a flock of doves. The elven nobles ignored her with a practiced, chilling perfection, their conversations flowing around her as if she were a piece of furniture. Lord Valerius, however, sought her out, his smile a predatory slash in his handsome face. "My lady," he began, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear, "I am told your talents lie in the simpler remedies, mud and weeds from your quarter, I presume. One must wonder at the king's desperation to place his faith in such rustic charms." The insult was a poisoned dart, and the quiet, condescending laughter of the surrounding nobles was the venom that followed, making her feel small, dirty, and utterly worthless. Theron, who had been speaking with a general across the room, seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. He moved to her side with a silent, lethal grace. He did not look at Valerius. He looked at Ilara, his expression unreadable, and placed a hand on the small of her back, a gesture of clear and public possession. "Lord Valerius," Theron said, his voice a low, cold murmur that cut through the chatter. The Lady Ilara's rustic charms have provided more solace and progress than the combined efforts of every court maid you so admire. Perhaps true wisdom is found not in ancient, dusty scrolls, but in the earth itself, a concept I fear your hands are too clean to ever grasp." The room fell into a stunned silence. Valerius's smile faltered, his face paling. Theron had not only defended her, he had elevated her knowledge above their own. Later, in the cold silence of their adjoining chambers, the tension from the banquet lingered like a foul miasma. Ilara stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself, the humiliation still burning in her cheeks. She was a liability, a weakness his enemies could exploit. She waited for the reprimand, for the anger. Instead, she heard the gentle clink of crystal. Theron was standing by a decanter, pouring 2 glasses of a pale golden wine. He handed one to her, his fingers brushing hers. "Their words are arrows," he said, his voice low. "Do not offer them a target by showing them your wounds." It was not an apology, nor was it comfort in the human sense. It was a lesson in survival in his world. It was an admission that they were on the same side, facing the same predators. The masquerade demanded more of them in the following weeks. They were forced to take daily walks in the palace's crystalline gardens, a public performance of their union. During one such walk, a young, bold courtier intercepted them, bowing low before Ilara. "My lady, the green of your gown rivals the first leaves of spring," he said, his eyes lingering on her with an appreciative gleam. Before Elara could respond, Theron's hand, which had been resting lightly on her arm, tightened its grip. It was not painful, but it was an unmistakable claiming. Her beauty is for the king's eyes to appreciate," Theron stated, his voice flat and cold as glacial ice. The courtier paled and practically fled. The raw, undisguised jealousy shocked Elara, sending a confusing, illicit thrill through her veins that felt dangerously real. That night she couldn't sleep. The memory of his possessive grip, the icy fire in his voice, replayed in her mind. She traced the cool, smooth line of the silver ring on her finger. This was supposed to be a pact, a political arrangement born of desperation. He was her protector, she was his cure. It was a transaction. But transactions did not involve quiet moments in libraries, shared confessions of pain, or flashes of fierce, animalistic jealousy over a meaningless compliment. The lines they had drawn were dissolving, washed away by a current of something deeper, something far more perilous. The question rose in her mind, a terrifying whisper in the dark. Are we just pretending? The thought that they might not be was the most frightening thing she had yet faced in this world of monsters and nobles. The simmering resentment of the court finally boiled over. Lord Valerius, emboldened by a faction of conservative lords, formally challenged the pact before the Royal Council. He stood in the center of the great hall, his voice ringing with righteous indignation. "We stand by while our kingdom is weakened by this human influence," he declared, his gaze falling on Elara with undisguised contempt. "He is enthralled by a hedge witch from the Mud Quarter, a commoner whose only magic is manipulation. I demand for the security of the realm that this farce of a union be dissolved and she be sent back to the dirt from whence she came." The public humiliation was absolute, stripping her of her title and her dignity, leaving her exposed and trembling before the most powerful elves in the kingdom. A dangerous stillness fell over the room. Theron did not move from his throne. For a long, terrifying moment, Elara thought he might agree, that the political pressure was too great. But then he rose, not with the measured grace of a king, but with the coiled tension of a predator. A palpable aura of power, cold and immense, rolled off him, pressing down on every being in the hall. His voice, when he spoke, it was not loud, but it held the crushing weight of an epoch. "You will address the Lady Elara, my consort, with the respect her station demands," he commanded. The air crackled. "Her wisdom has kept the shade at bay when all of you offered nothing but fear. Her presence at my side is not a topic for debate. It is my will. To question her is to question me. Let any who wish to do so step forward now." No one moved. No one breathed. Valerius stood frozen, his political maneuvering shattered against a wall of absolute monarchal power. Theron had not merely defended her. He had irrevocably bound her status to his own, making any attack on her a direct act of treason. He descended the steps of the dais and, in a move that stunned the entire court, he took her hand in his. His grip was firm, an anchor in the storm of their stares. He looked at her, and in his stormy eyes she saw it all. The fury, the possessiveness, the raw, terrifying truth. He had not defended a political asset or a magical cure. He had defended her. The realization struck her with the force of a tidal wave, stealing her breath. The cage had become a shield, and its keeper was willing to burn his kingdom to the ground to protect her. Their victory, however, was a fragile thing. That very evening, they were summoned by the high priest and the elders of the council. The mood was not contrite, but grimly resolute. "Your Majesty," the high priest began, his voice dry as bone dust, "your devotion to the Lady Elara has been made clear, but it has also created a new political crisis. Lord Valerius and his faction now argue that if this union is so essential to the kingdom's stability, it must be fully legitimized according to ancient law." He paused, his old eyes fixing on Ilara. "They demand a ceremony of blessing to ensure the continuation of the royal bloodline. They are demanding that you provide the kingdom with the promise of an heir." The demand was a trap, forcing their political masquerade into an inescapable physical reality. The council's demand fell upon the quiet chambers like a shroud, suffocating the fragile intimacy they had begun to build. Theron turned from her, the line of his back a rigid wall of ice, and began to pace before the cold hearth. The air, once charged with unspoken chemistry, was now thick with a new, horrifying silence. This was no longer a political masquerade played for the court. It had become an inescapable, physical mandate that stripped away all pretense and left only a raw, unbearable reality. Ilara felt the borrowed silks of her gown turn to lead, weighing her down, trapping her. The man who had defended her, who had shown her flashes of a tormented soul she was beginning to care for, had vanished. In his place was the king, the strategist, the architect of her gilded cage, and she realized with a sickening lurch that the bars had just grown tighter, colder, and infinitely more personal. Her voice, when she found it, was a low, trembling thing, but it carried the sharp edge of betrayal. "An heir?" she asked, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Uda, is that the next stage of our arrangement? Have I graduated from a magical cure to a royal broodmare?" The accusation hung between them, sharp and poisoned. Theron stopped pacing, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides, but he refused to look at her. "It is what is necessary," he stated, his tone devoid of all emotion, a king's decree meant to crush dissent. "Valerius has forced my hand. The council sees this as the only path to secure the line and quell rebellion. Your role is to ensure that security—" His words were stones, each one a calculated blow meant to bruise, to create distance. He was deliberately hurting her, pushing her away into the cold, safe box of political necessity because the truth of his own feelings had become too dangerous to acknowledge. He finally turned to face her, and the torment in his eyes belied the coldness of his words. The kingly facade fractured, revealing the desperate man beneath. "There is more to this than politics," he confessed, his voice dropping to a raw, ragged whisper. "There is a prophecy, one my family has hidden for 1,000 years. It foretells that the feral shade will not only consume the last of my line, but will shatter the very foundations of this kingdom. Unless the blood of silver is bound to a heart of earth before the final blood moon rises." He took a ragged breath, the weight of the secret crushing him. "My mages searched for a ritual, an artifact. They never considered it could be a person. You, and that moon, it rises in less than a month. If this bond is not sealed, the beast will be unleashed forever, and all of this will turn to dust." The revelation stunned her into silence, the sheer scale of his desperation reframing everything. This wasn't just about his throne, it was a race against a prophesied apocalypse. The moral weight of his deception, of forcing her into this pact, settled heavily in his gaze. "I should have told you the truth from the beginning," he admitted, the words an agony. "But to tell you was to ask you to sacrifice yourself for a dying kingdom, to ask you to face a monster you did not create. I chose to command you, to bind you with a pact, because it was a cruelty I could bear. It was easier than admitting the truth." He looked at her then, his defenses utterly gone, his stormy eyes filled with a terrifying vulnerability. "It was easier than admitting I needed you. Not just your magic to save me from myself. I couldn't bear the thought of you saying no." Her anger dissolved, washed away by a tidal wave of empathy that left her breathless. The truth was a more intricate prison than any lie he could have constructed. It bound them together not by a pact, but by the shared weight of impending doom. "So we are to play our parts," she whispered, the question fragile. We let the court believe we are creating a dynasty while we are truly fighting the end of the world. What does that make us, Theron? What are we in the quiet moments when the court isn't watching? He took a single step toward her, his hand rising as if to caress her cheek before letting it fall, defeated. "I do not know," he said, the admission a total surrender of his kingly power. "I only know that walking this path without you beside me is no longer a possibility I can entertain. Without you, I am already a ghost." A fragile, agonizing truce settled between them in the days that followed. They were two souls adrift on a dark sea, the prophecy a storm on the horizon, and their unspoken feelings the dangerous current beneath. The summons came at dawn, delivered by a grim-faced herald. The Royal Council was convened in emergency session. A proclamation was expected. As they walked the long, silent corridor toward the throne room, the murmur of the assembled court, a low, predatory hum. Theron stopped her. He took her hand, his grip not kingly or possessive, but desperate, the touch of a drowning man. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "No matter what I am forced to say in that room, no matter what decree I make, know that every word is meant to protect you. Trust me." Before she could question him, the great silverwood doors swung open, revealing the hostile sea of elven nobility. The high priest stepped forward, his voice booming in the sudden silence. "Your Majesty, the council and the kingdom await your decision." Theron stepped into the center of the council hall, the weight of 1,000 years of monarchy settling upon his shoulders. He did not look at the expectant faces of the elders or the smug, triumphant sneer on Valerius's face. His gaze found Ilara, a lone island of fragile strength in a sea of ancient hostility. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, but beneath it, the same defiant courage that had faced down his monstrous form in the forest. His promise to her echoed in his mind. "Trust me." The prophecy demanded a bond, the council demanded an heir, and his rival demanded his ruin. But in that moment, looking at the woman who had quieted the storm in his soul, he knew that none of their demands mattered as much as the unspoken truth that had grown between them in stolen moments and shared silence. The fate of his kingdom rested not on a decree, but on a confession he was terrified to make. He began to speak, his voice resonating with the cold, absolute authority they expected. "The council is correct," he stated, and a wave of satisfaction rippled through Valerius's faction. "The stability of this kingdom is paramount. The continuation of the royal line is a sacred duty." He paused, letting the weight of their assumptions settle in the vast hall. Then he turned his full attention away from the council, away from the throne, and faced Ilara directly, making the entire world of elven politics shrink until it was nothing more than the space between them. But stability is not born of bloodlines alone. It is born of strength, and true strength is not the absence of weakness, but the courage to embrace it. He took a step toward her, his voice softening, becoming something raw and personal, meant only for her, yet witnessed by all. "My entire life has been a battle to contain a beast. You did not run from it. You soothed it. This pact," he declared, his voice ringing with a new, profound clarity that silenced every whisper in the room, "was a lie, a coward's stratagem to keep you close while keeping my own heart safe behind a king's decree." He was no longer speaking to the council. He was laying his soul bare before her. "I did not bind you to me to cure a curse. I bound you to me because, from the moment your magic touched mine, I knew that a world without you in it was a world already lost to darkness. The prophecy speaks of a heart of earth, binding to blood of silver. It was never about a political union or a forced heir. It was about this." He reached out, his hand trembling almost imperceptibly, and cupped her cheek. It was about a king finally admitting that his greatest strength is not his crown, but the disgraced human herbalist who taught him that even monsters are worthy of a gentle touch. Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, washing away the last ghosts of her past. In his public confession, in his utter world-shattering vulnerability, she found her own absolution. He was not her keeper. He was her equal, a soul as scarred as her own. She leaned into his touch, a silent acceptance that was more powerful than any vow. The court watched, breathless, as their infallible king offered his shattered heart to a human commoner. "Theron," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, the silver of his hair mingling with her dark brown locks. "I choose this," she said, her voice growing stronger, clearer. "Not as a consort, not as a cure. I choose you." He closed his eyes, a shudder of profound relief running through him, and then he kissed her. It was not a king's claim or a pact seal, but a desperate, beautiful collision of two souls who had finally found their way home. The kiss was a revolution. It shattered centuries of prejudice, broke the back of Valerius's political ambitions, and rewrote the prophecy in a single, heartfelt instant. As their lips parted, a deep, resonant calm settled over Theron. A peace so profound it was a physical presence in the room. The feral shade, the ancient rage that had been his constant companion, was not gone, but it was no longer a beast clawing at a cage. It was a quiet, slumbering power, finally at rest, balanced by the gentle strength of the woman in his arms. The nobles of the court, witnessing this undeniable transformation, this raw display of a power greater than any bloodline, slowly, one by one, knelt. They were not bowing to a political alliance, but to a love that had just saved them all. Valerius stood alone for a moment, his face a mask of disbelief and ruin, before he too was forced to his knees by the sheer weight of their devotion. Months later, under a sky cleansed of its sickly magical blight, Ilara stood on a balcony overlooking the capital. The scent of death bloom was a forgotten memory, replaced by the sweet fragrance of night jasmine from the gardens below. Theron came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his hand gently over the slight swell of her stomach. The kingdom was healing, and with it, so were they. The beast within him was now a silent guardian, a protective warmth she felt whenever he was near. They were not a king and his consort, but two halves of a single soul, forged in shame and shadow, now bound by a love that had defied a curse and remade a world. Their story became a quiet legend, a testament that the greatest magic is not found in power or prophecy, but in the courage to see the broken parts of another and call them beautiful. If their journey has touched your heart, please show your support by liking, commenting with your favorite moment, and subscribing for more tales of love against all odds.